1. Welcome. Laura rented a house in a small, remote village, hoping to spend a few months in peace and solitude. The city was wearing her out. The hustle and bustle was making her depressed, and the only thing she wanted was quiet. The house looked old, but sturdy. Wooden walls, a fireplace, Victorian-style furniture. The only thing that alarmed Laura was the lack of windows. Instead, mirrors hung in all the rooms, large, heavy, in carved frames. There were a lot of them, and they covered almost all the walls. "It's a strange design decision," she muttered as she passed the mirror in the living room. Her reflection seemed too clear, but she paid it no mind. 2. Reflections. The first night Laura couldn't sleep. It seemed as if someone was in the house. She heard light footsteps outside the walls, but she wrote it off to the old house and its familiar creaks. The most disturbing part, however, was the feeling of being watched. Every time she turned her head to the mirror, she saw only her reflection, but something inside told her it wasn't moving the way it should. The next day she decided to examine all the mirrors. One in the bedroom struck her as odd. It seemed deeper than it should be, as if there was a darkness inside, stretching out into infinity. She reached out, touched the cold surface, and shuddered. She felt the mirror move forward a little. 3. Whispering. On the third night, Laura awoke to a barely audible sound. It was a whisper coming from the mirrors. She froze, her heart pounding frantically. She couldn't make out the words, but she thought the voices were arguing, as if deciding what to do with her. She grabbed the lantern and walked around the house. The whispers died down as she approached the mirrors, but as soon as she stepped back, the voices returned. Laura tried to sleep, but before she did, she glanced at the bedroom mirror. Her reflection stood just as she did, but its lips were moving even though she hadn't spoken a word. 4. Crack. In the morning, Laura found a thin crack on the living room mirror. She didn't remember dropping anything or hitting it. Looking into the reflection, she saw something strange. Something seemed to move in the depths of the mirror, a dark shadow, almost imperceptible. She tried to look away, but her reflection lingered for a moment before following her. Laura recoiled back. She must have just imagined it, but doubts were already beginning to gnaw at her mind. 5. The creature inside. Later that night, Laura sat in the kitchen and tried to concentrate on the book. The light from the table lamp cast soft shadows on the walls, but when she looked at the mirror across the room, it seemed to her darker. Her reflection was still there, but behind it stood a figure, tall, with a blank face that only had 2 deep dips instead of eyes. It was smiling, wide, abnormally. Laura turned around sharply, but there was no one behind her, only her own trembling shadow. When she looked in the mirror again, the creature was gone. 6. They want out. It was clear to her now, mirrors are not just glass. Someone is in there. Laura wanted to leave, but the car wouldn't start. She dialed the landlady's number, but the phone didn't work. Anxiety grew. She began to cover the mirrors with a cloth, but every morning she found them open again. The cracks in the glass were multiplying. Blackness seemed to ooze out of them. The whispering grew louder. It was calling to her. "Laura," came from the mirror in the hallway. "Let us go." She screamed and rushed into the bedroom, locking the door. But in the mirror opposite the bed, the reflection was smiling. It slowly raised its hand and pointed a finger at her. 7. Run if you can. That night something broke through. Laura woke up to an eerie sound, a cracking sound, like glass breaking, coming from all directions. She jumped up, shining a flashlight into the room. All the mirrors cracked, and thick, oily darkness oozed from them. Then hands appeared out of the darkness, long, thin, unnaturally curved. They reached for her. Laura screamed and rushed toward the door. There was a low rustle behind her, as if something huge was moving across the floor. She ran out of the house without even slamming the door and ran to the car. The car finally started, and she sped away. She never looked back. 8. One last look. Laura reached the nearest town, checked herself in the rearview mirror, and flinched. The reflection smiled at her, and it wasn't repeating her movements. 1. Assignment. Journalist Dan Carter didn't like to write about mysticism. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, and other nonsense that newspaper columns liked to fill them with. But the assignment was clear: spend the night at the abandoned Whitestone Hotel and write a story about its imminent demolition. Don't worry, Dan, ghosts won't bite. The editor grinned, handing him the keys to the hotel. He was wrong. 2. An abandoned place. Whitestone towered over the hill like a tired giant. Its facade had long since shabby, its windows staring blankly into the sky. Dan stepped inside. Dusty chandeliers, cracked wallpaper, and the smell of dampness surrounded him. He paced the hallway until he found a door with a tarnished brass plaque, 303. The key slid into the lock with difficulty. The door opened with a painful creak. 3. Inside the room. The room looked like someone had just lived here. The bed was made, and there was an old telephone receiver on the table. However, the mirror above the bed was covered in a cloudy film, and Dan noticed that his reflection seemed not what it should be. Laughter. Somewhere far down the hallway, laughter rang out, a child's. 4. Disappearing guests. Dan sat down at his desk and opened the old guest register. He ran his eyes over the names. Many of them were crossed out, as if they had been tried to be erased. Then he noticed an oddity: everyone who stayed at 303 was missing. His heart clenched. Could it be a coincidence? There was a knock on the door. 5. Guest in the mirror. Dan froze. The knock was repeated. He slowly walked over and turned the knob. There was no one behind the door. But when he returned to the room, his reflection in the mirror hadn't moved. 6. The living reflection. Dan watched in horror as his mirror double smiled. The lips in the reflection parted, exposing unrealistically white teeth. "You came," came a voice from the mirror, but Dan's lips didn't move. He stepped back, but the reflection remained motionless, only its eyes following him. "You're next." 7. Escape. Dan rushed to the door, yanked the knob. It was locked. How? He hadn't locked it. A creak was heard behind him. The reflection came out of the mirror. 8. Last entry. The newspapers said journalist Dan Carter was missing. His laptop was found in room 303. The last line printed on the screen read, "They are watching. Do not enter 303.